There is a question that sits at the center of a great deal of human suffering, a question that arrives most forcefully when circumstances are at their worst. The question is not, why is this happening in the causal sense? It is the question underneath that one. What does this mean? Is there anything here worth enduring for? Is there a reason to keep going?
Viktor Frankl spent 3 years inside the Nazi concentration camp system at Theresienstadt, at Auschwitz, at 2 subcamps of Dachau. He lost his parents, his brother, and his pregnant wife in the camps. He survived. And what he built from that experience, both the psychological framework and the life that followed, is one of the most important and most personally tested contributions to the philosophy of suffering in the 20th century.
Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Shawn.
And I'm Claire. Today we are talking about Frankl, about his logotherapy, about the will to meaning, about what he observed in the camps regarding who survived and who did not, and about the broader philosophical claim his work represents. That meaning is not discovered in the world but made, and that the capacity to make it is one of the things that cannot finally be taken from a human being. Big ideas, human conversations. Let's go.
Viktor Frankl was born in Vienna in 1895 into a Jewish family. He showed an early and intense interest in psychology. He was corresponding with Sigmund Freud in his teens, and Freud arranged for one of his papers to be published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis when Frankl was still in secondary school. He trained as a psychiatrist, worked with suicidal patients in Vienna in the 1920s and 30s, and developed the outlines of what would become logotherapy before the war.
The name comes from the Greek word logos, which in this context means meaning. Frankl's central claim, which he arrived at partly through his clinical work with depressed and suicidal patients, and partly through his reading of thinkers like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, was that the primary human drive is not pleasure, as Freud argued, and not power, as Adler argued, but meaning, the will to meaning, the need to find a reason or to make one for the life you are living.
In September of 1942, Frankl, his wife, and his parents were deported to Theresienstadt. He was later transferred to Auschwitz and then to 2 subcamps. His father died of starvation and pneumonia at Theresienstadt. His mother was killed at Auschwitz. His brother died in the subcamp. His wife Tilly died at Bergen-Belsen in the final weeks of the war. Frankl was liberated in April of 1945. He was 40 years old. He had lost almost everyone he loved. And he began writing immediately.
Man's Search for Meaning, published in German in 1946 and translated into English in 1959, is probably the best-known work of existential psychology ever written. It has sold tens of millions of copies and has been translated into dozens of languages. The Library of Congress named it one of the 10 most influential books in the United States. And it has the particular authority of a book written not from the safety of an armchair, but from a position of extremity that most of its readers cannot imagine, and that its author survived by, in part, practicing what he preached.
Frankl lived until 1997. He was 92 when he died. Still working, still lecturing, still arguing for logotherapy against what he called the existential vacuum of modern life. He learned to fly a private plane in his 60s. He climbed a mountain in his 80s. He was, by every account, a man who had come back from the worst possible circumstances with a quality of life force that was itself a kind of testimony. It is worth saying something about the specific intellectual context in which Frankl developed his ideas, because it matters for understanding why the framework looks the way it does. Vienna in the 1920s and 30s was one of the most fertile intellectual environments in the history of psychology. Freud was still working. Adler had already broken with Freud and developed individual psychology. There was a rich conversation happening about the nature of the self, the structure of motivation, and what therapy was actually for. Frankl participated in that conversation from the beginning, and his framework was shaped by it both by what he accepted from it and by what he explicitly rejected.
His rejection of the pleasure principle as the primary human motivator was not arbitrary. He worked for years at a suicide prevention center in Vienna, counseling young people who were at risk, and what he consistently found was that the absence of meaning, not the absence of pleasure, not the absence of achievement, not even poverty or social isolation, was the common thread in the most serious cases. People who had comfort and safety and social connection but had lost a sense of what their life was for were often more at risk than people who had very little materially but had something to live for. That clinical observation preceded the camps. The camps confirmed it under conditions of maximum possible extremity.
That clinical observation is essential. Frankl's framework was not just theoretical. It was rooted in years of practical work, both before and during the camps.
I want to spend some time on what Frankl actually observed in the camps, because his psychological framework did not emerge from purely theoretical reflection. It emerged from watching human beings in conditions of absolute extremity and trying to understand what made the difference between those who survived psychologically intact and those who did not.
His observations, which he is careful to characterize as those of a psychiatrist and a prisoner rather than as scientific data, pointed consistently toward one variable: the presence or absence of meaning. Not comfort, not safety, not even physical resources, though those mattered in the obvious ways. What Frankl noticed was that the prisoners who had a reason, a specific person they needed to survive for, a specific work they believed they had to finish, a faith that gave suffering a place in a larger story, tended to be more psychologically resilient than those who did not.
He quotes Nietzsche repeatedly in the book. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. That formulation is not original to Frankl, it is Nietzsche's, but Frankl observed it operating in conditions Nietzsche never imagined. The prisoners who gave up, in his account, were often not the ones in the worst physical condition. They were the ones who had lost their why, who could no longer see a future for themselves, who could no longer connect their continued survival to anything that mattered. The body was still alive. The meaning had gone out.
This connects directly to the work of Hans Selye on stress and to later research on what is sometimes called psychological hardiness, the cluster of attitudes and beliefs that appear to protect people against the worst effects of severe adversity. The research consistently identifies meaning as one of the central variables, not optimism. Frankl was not an optimist in the naive sense, and he was suspicious of the demand that prisoners maintain a cheerful attitude. Meaning is different from optimism. Optimism is a claim about how things will turn out. Meaning is a claim about what things are for.
Frankl was also a careful observer of the psychological deterioration that the camps produced in most prisoners, the progressive attrition of the self that the dehumanizing conditions were designed to achieve. He describes the initial shock of arrival, the apathetic middle phase in which normal emotional responses become blunted, and the liberation phase, which he found almost as psychologically dangerous as the camps themselves, the sudden confrontation with freedom and the world outside, which many prisoners could not navigate without breakdown. His account is not triumphalist. It is honest about how much was destroyed, even in the survivors.
What he insists on throughout is the reality of what he calls the last of the human freedoms. Even in conditions of absolute external constraint, conditions in which every aspect of your life was controlled and most of the people you loved were dead, there remained, he argues, a margin of inner freedom. The freedom to choose your attitude toward your situation. Not to change it, not to escape it, but to decide what stance you would take toward it. That freedom, he argues, cannot be taken away. It can be made very difficult to exercise. But it cannot be eliminated without the person's own complicity.
Let us get precise about what logotherapy actually claims, because it is often summarized in ways that make it sound simpler and more comforting than it actually is.
The first and most fundamental claim is that the primary human motivation is the will to meaning, not the will to pleasure, that is Freud's formulation, not the will to power, that is Adler's. Frankl argued that both pleasure and power are derivative. We want them because we believe they will produce meaning, or because the absence of meaning drives us to substitute them for it. Meaning itself is the primary thing. And when it is genuinely present, when a person has a real sense that their life is for something, that what they do matters, pleasure and power become secondary concerns.
The second claim is that meaning cannot be given or prescribed. It has to be found, or more precisely, discovered by each person in their own situation. Frankl is emphatic about this. There is no universal meaning that applies to everyone. There is no formula. Logotherapy is not about telling people what their life should mean. It is about helping them find or create a meaning that is genuinely theirs, that fits their actual situation, that they can live from with full conviction.
He identifies three main pathways through which meaning can be found. The first is through what we create or accomplish, through work, through contribution, through making something that matters. The second is through what we experience or encounter, through beauty, through truth, through the love of another person. And the third, the one that is most relevant to the camp experience, is through the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. When suffering cannot be avoided, when the circumstances cannot be changed, the last remaining freedom is the freedom to choose how to bear what cannot be changed. And that choice, Frankl argues, is not nothing. It is, in extreme circumstances, everything.
The third main claim is about what he calls the existential vacuum, a condition he believed was increasingly prevalent in modern life. When traditional sources of meaning break down, when religion loses its authority, when cultural traditions become uncertain, when the roles and purposes that societies once reliably provided to individuals are no longer stable, people are left with a freedom that they are not equipped to fill. The result is not liberation, it is emptiness, boredom, depression, the compulsive pursuit of pleasure or sensation to fill a space that pleasure cannot actually fill. Frankl saw the existential vacuum as the defining spiritual crisis of the modern world, and he thought logotherapy was one response to it, though he was realistic about what therapy alone could do.
He also distinguished sharply between meaning and happiness. This is one of the most important aspects of his framework and one of the most easily missed. Happiness, Frankl argued, cannot be pursued directly. It is a byproduct. It arises when you are engaged in meaningful activity, when you are living in accordance with your values, when you are genuinely connected to something or someone that matters to you. The person who pursues happiness directly, who makes feeling good the primary aim, tends to miss both happiness and meaning. The person who pursues meaning, who finds something worth working for, worth suffering for, worth staying alive for, tends to find that happiness arrives unrequested, as a companion to the meaningful life rather than its goal. The third pathway, the attitude toward unavoidable suffering, is the one most people find hardest to accept, and I want to spend a moment on it because I think it is often misread as a form of resignation or passive acceptance. It is not. Frankl is not saying that suffering is good, or that you should seek it out, or that you should simply accept whatever is done to you without resistance. He is saying something more specific, that when suffering genuinely cannot be avoided, when the circumstances genuinely cannot be changed, the question of what you do with your response to it is still open. That is not resignation. That is the precise opposite of resignation. It is the claim that even here, even now, even in this, you are not simply a passive object of what is happening to you. Something in you is still authoring a response.
The contemporary research on post-traumatic growth is relevant here, and it is worth naming because it complicates the picture in a useful way. Post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon in which people emerge from serious adversity, not just intact, but in some respects genuinely changed for the better, is real and well documented. But it is not automatic. It does not happen to everyone who suffers. And it does not mean the suffering was worth it or should have happened. What distinguishes those who experience growth from those who do not is not the severity of the trauma. It is partly the meaning-making that follows, the narrative that gets constructed, whether the experience gets integrated into a story about who you are and what you are for, or whether it remains a wound that simply sits in the self without being metabolized.
Frankl would recognize that distinction immediately. The suffering does not produce the growth. The response to the suffering, the active work of finding or making a meaning that can hold what happened and point towards something, is what produces the growth. And that work is never completed once and for all. It is the ongoing labor of the examined life applied to the hardest material.
That ongoing process is what makes Frankl's framework both challenging and genuinely hopeful. It's not a one-time discovery, but a continual act of searching and responding. Frankl's work sits within a broader tradition of existentialist thought, the tradition we have been visiting throughout this show, through Sartre, de Beauvoir, Camus, and Arendt. But his relationship to that tradition is complicated and worth unpacking, because his existentialism is, in important respects, different from the French variety.
The central difference is on the question of meaning. Sartre and Camus both confronted the absence of inherent meaning in the universe, the claim that reality does not come preloaded with significance, that there is no cosmic script for your life, no divine purpose that determines what your existence is for. Sartre's response was radical freedom. You are condemned to invent your own meaning, and the responsibility for that invention is total and inescapable. Camus' response was revolt. You acknowledge the absurd, the gap between your need for meaning and the universe's indifference, and you choose to live and create anyway, in defiance rather than denial.
Frankl shares the existentialist starting point, the self-determination of the individual, the impossibility of relying on external authority to provide meaning, but he is considerably more optimistic about what is actually available. He argues that meaning is not invented, but discovered, that it is genuinely out there, in your situation, in the specific demands and possibilities that your life actually presents. The task is not to create meaning from nothing, but to perceive what is already there. And this perception requires a kind of attention and honesty that is the opposite of the existential vacuum's passive drifting.
He was also deeply influenced by the phenomenological tradition by Husserl and Heidegger, and by thinkers like Max Scheler, who argued for a hierarchy of values that is genuinely objective, rather than merely chosen. Frankl is not a relativist about meaning. He does not think all meanings are equally valid. He thinks some responses to suffering are better, more honest, more fully human, more productive of genuine flourishing than others. And he thinks the capacity to distinguish between them is something that can be cultivated through reflection, through therapy, through the kind of honest self-examination we have been discussing throughout this show.
The connection to Arendt is worth making explicit. Frankl and Arendt were contemporaries who never, as far as I know, engaged directly with each other's work. But they were responding to the same catastrophe from different angles. Arendt asked, "How did ordinary people participate in this? What failure of thinking made Eichmann possible?" Frankl asked, "How do people survive this? What inner resources make it possible to preserve a human self under conditions designed to destroy it?" The two questions are the obverse of each other, and together they constitute one of the most serious philosophical engagements with the Holocaust that the century produced.
The comparison with Camus is particularly interesting because Camus also confronted the question of whether life is worth living in the face of a universe that offers no inherent meaning. But Camus' response, the revolt, the defiant yes in the face of the absurd, is fundamentally a response to philosophical despair rather than to actual suffering. Camus was writing about the existential condition of modern humanity, not from inside a death camp, and his answer, keep creating, keep loving, keep living in defiance, is heroic and beautiful, but does not quite address the question that Frankl was living inside.
Frankl's question is harder than Camus'. Camus asks, given that the universe is meaningless, how do we justify choosing to live? Frankl asks, given that everything you love has been taken, that you are being systematically degraded and destroyed, that the people around you are dying, is there still a reason? And his answer is not the romantic heroism of revolt. It is something quieter and more precise. It is the observation that meaning is available even here. That the perception of meaning, the finding of something or someone that makes the continued endurance of the unbearable worthwhile, does not require comfortable circumstances. It requires only the willingness to keep looking.
Frankl's answer to his own question, the inner resource that makes survival possible, is meaning. Not any particular meaning, not a theological meaning necessarily, though he was himself religious in a particular way. Just the presence of a why, something that makes the how bearable, and the willingness to search for that why, even in conditions that seem to have eliminated every reason for it. One of the most striking passages in Man's Search for Meaning is Frankl's account of a specific moment in the camps when he found himself thinking obsessively about his wife, not knowing whether she was alive or dead, holding her image in his mind as he marched in the dark before dawn through ice and snow. And he realized in that moment that the love he felt for her was not contingent on whether she was alive, on whether he would ever see her again, on any external fact at all. The love was real and present in him. And that reality, the simple fact that something mattered, that someone mattered, was enough to make the marching bearable.
He quotes Dostoevsky in this context. "There is only one thing I dread not to be worthy of my sufferings." That formulation is extraordinary. Most of us, confronted with suffering, ask, why is this happening to me? Is this fair? What did I do to deserve this? Dostoevsky's formulation inverts the question entirely. The suffering is not the problem. The question is whether you are meeting it with sufficient quality of response, whether you are becoming, through the bearing of it, the kind of person the suffering calls for. That is a much more demanding orientation. And it is, Frankl argues, the orientation that protects the self even in conditions of maximum external assault. I want to be honest about where Frankl's framework has been challenged, because I think he deserves the same critical attention we have given to every other thinker in this series.
The most serious criticism is empirical. Frankl's account of who survived in the camps, the claim that those with a why could bear almost any how, has been questioned by historians and psychologists who argue that survival in the camps was overwhelmingly a matter of luck, of work assignment, of physical constitution, of who happened to be selected for labor rather than immediate death. The meaningful few who survived the selection process did not survive because they had found meaning. They survived because the SS selected them for their youth, their strength, or their skills. To retrospectively attribute their survival to their psychological resources risks, implying that those who did not survive lacked those resources, which is both historically inaccurate and morally troubling.
Frankl was aware of this criticism and acknowledged that luck and circumstances were determining for most outcomes. His claim was more specific. that among those who were in comparable circumstances, meaning made a difference to psychological resilience and to the quality of the survival, not that meaning determined who lived and who died, the Nazis determined that, but that meaning influenced how the surviving was endured and what kind of person came out the other side.
There is also the question of whether the framework generalizes from extremity to ordinary life in the way Frankl suggests. The conditions of the concentration camp are so far outside normal human experience that lessons drawn from them may not transfer cleanly. In the camps, the stakes of meaning were existential in the most literal sense. Survival was at issue. In ordinary life, the absence of meaning produces boredom, depression, addiction, a kind of low-grade despair. Those are serious, but they are not the same thing. The question of whether logotherapy is equally useful in ordinary existential emptiness as it was in extreme suffering is one that the clinical literature has had to work out empirically rather than deducing from the camp's experience.
The evidence on that question is generally positive. Logotherapy and the meaning-centered approaches it inspired, including what Paul Wong has called meaning therapy and what Michael Steger has done with meaning in life research, have accumulated a substantial evidence base. The presence of meaning in life is consistently associated with lower rates of depression and anxiety, better physical health outcomes, more resilience in the face of adversity, and greater overall well-being. The mechanism Frankl proposed, that meaning functions as a buffer against suffering and an engine of engagement, has held up reasonably well under empirical examination.
What I think genuinely survives the criticisms is not a specific theory, but an orientation. The insistence that the question of meaning is not optional, that it cannot be indefinitely deferred, that the absence of a genuine answer to what is this for has real costs that accumulate over time, that seems to me both empirically supported and philosophically sound. And the insistence that meaning is available even in the worst circumstances, that the margin of inner freedom, however narrow, is real, is both a hard-won observation and one of the most hopeful claims in the philosophical tradition.
There is also something important in the way Frankl frames the relationship between meaning and responsibility. He argues that meaning is not just something you find, but something you are answerable to. If your life has a specific meaning, a task only you can complete, a person only you can love in the particular way you love them, a contribution only your specific history and capacities make possible, then you have a responsibility toward that meaning. The question is not only what does my life mean, but what does my life demand of me? That reframing from passive recipient of meaning to active respondent to its demands is one of the things that distinguishes logotherapy from vaguer forms of meaning seeking.
And it connects directly to everything else we have done in this show. The examined life, as Socrates described it, is not just a life of reflection. It is a life of responsiveness, of being genuinely accountable to what the examination reveals. Frankl is describing the same thing from the ground up rather than the top down. You do not start with a philosophy and then apply it to your life. You start with your life, with your specific situation, your specific losses, your specific relationships and capacities and possibilities, and you ask what meaning it holds and what it is asking of you. The philosophy follows from that asking, and the asking never stops. I want to say something about why this episode feels personally important to me, because I think this show works best when we are honest about what we bring to the material, rather than pretending to approach it from nowhere.
Please.
The grief episode was the most personal thing I have done on this show. And what I did not say there, because it was not the right place for it, is that one of the hardest things about losing someone to suicide is the question of meaning. Not just the grief, not just the absence, but the specific difficulty of making sense of a death that by its nature suggests that the person who died could not find a why sufficient to bear their how. That is a different kind of loss than other losses. And it sits with you in a different way.
Frankl's framework does not resolve that. Nothing resolves that. But it offers something I find genuinely useful, which is the insistence that the search for meaning is worth continuing, even especially when it has been interrupted by the worst possible thing. That the question of what your life is for does not get answered once and then filed away. It gets answered again and again in the specific circumstances of each new situation you find yourself in, including the situation of loss, including the situation of grief, including the situation of trying to understand a death that resists understanding.
Frankl wrote something that I have come back to many times. He wrote that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. I do not think that is comforting in the way people sometimes reach for comfort. It is not a promise that things will be okay. It is a more demanding claim that even in the middle of the worst, the question of how you respond to it is still yours. That the suffering does not get to determine everything, that something remains.
That something remains. I think that is the most honest way to put it. Not that meaning is easy to find or always present, or that suffering is ever truly worth what it costs. But that the search for meaning, the refusal to let circumstances be the final word on what your life is for, is itself a form of freedom. And it is one that Frankl tested under conditions that leave very little room for doubt about whether he meant it.
I want to close the reflection by saying something about this show. We built it partly because we believe that philosophy can actually help, not as a set of answers, but as a set of better questions. Frankl is one of the clearest demonstrations of that belief. He did not survive because he had better information or more resources. He survived because he had a framework, a way of asking what this means, and what it is asking of me that held even when everything else was stripped away. That is what philosophy at its most serious is for. Not comfort, not certainty. A framework that holds. Next week, we are moving into the philosophy of language, what it means for words to mean anything at all, why Wittgenstein said that the limits of my language are the limits of my world, and what happens when we take seriously the idea that our most fundamental concepts might be more fragile than we assume.
If this episode reached you where you are, share it with someone who might need it. That is how this show finds the people it is meant for.
Sources and further reading are in the show notes.
We are Philosophy for Lunch. New episodes every Sunday.
Big ideas, human conversations.
See you next week.